Things are getting pretty serious now that the President of the United States has tested positive for COVID 19. That being said, welcome to another episode of The Months the Earth Stood Still, the series where I watch physically owned copies of films that are tied with the theme of COVID 19 and the pandemic while in a second lockdown. So, it's time to blast out that Bob Marley and strap yourselves in for another episode videotaped live inside of a studio apartment here in Burbank, California. Now, before we go on, I have to acknowledge the fact that the movie that I'm going to review is the third adaptation of the Richard Matheson novel, I Am Legend. I Am Legend, the novel, has been adapted into film a few times. The first version starred Vincent Price in what is now called The Last Man on Earth. And I did a video on that in season 1. I think it was the first film that I went over when the pandemic started. The second iteration was The Omega Man, which starred Charlton Heston. Now, the reason that I skipped that one was because I didn't have a physical copy of the Omega Man to go over while I was, in lockdown. I do, however, own a copy of I Am Legend, which is the third film adaptation that came out in 2008 starring Will Smith. And speaking of threes, and this being the third adaptation, and the fact that I wasn't able to review the Omega Man, to compensate for that, I am going to partake in taking some omega-3 vitamins to stay healthy during this pandemic while reviewing I Am Legend as, again, as compensation for not being able to review the Omega Man. So, without further ado, cheers. There we go. Get some of that fish oil in there. Now, moving forward. Now, this is the third adaptation of Richard Matheson's novel, which I highly recommend you check out. It's the idea of the novel and some of the film adaptations is that a virus has spread all over the globe, which turns people that are infected into vampires, for lack of a better description. And the idea came to Richard Matheson after he had seen Dracula, and to him, Dracula was so scary that wouldn't it be more frightening if there were thousands of vampires instead of just one? And so that's how he kind of came up with the story of I Am Legend. And he also grounded it with a little bit of pseudoscience as well. Now, the third film adaptation, which I said came out in 2008, stars Will Smith. It's a big budget film from Warner Brothers. I believe the Omega Man was also from Warner Brothers as well. Will Smith is in this. It is a very solid performance by Will Smith. He plays Robert Neville, which is the main character of the novel as well. And Robert Neville is immune to this virus that has turned everyone into these zombie-like versions of human beings. And what's really cool about this is that with each film iteration, there's kind of a slightly different explanation for how the origin of the virus spreads. In this particular version, they go with the idea that the cure is worse than the disease. We have a quick cameo appearance by Emma Thompson, who plays a scientist that has developed a cure for cancer. And through various news clips, this is the implication that somehow this cure got out of hand, and those that were diagnosed with cancer had the cure had a reverse effect, and they become these zombie-like apparitions, which I do have some criticisms on, which I will go into in a little bit. But the film itself, in a general sense, is solid, and I do recommend viewing it. There's some genuinely creepy moments in it. Like I said, Will Smith gives a very solid performance. In preparation for this film, Will Smith had interviewed, I believe he interviewed veterans that were held prisoner, I think prisoners of war. I know that he interviewed people that were in a state of isolation for a period of time to kind of get a sense of what they were going through, and for the most part, it's believable. The shots of a desolate New York City are wonderful. They're wonderfully rendered with, with all kinds of shrubbery and moss growing, from sidewalks and sides of skyscrapers. You really do get that sense of a desolate city. During pre-production, I believe one of the original locations that they were going to use was Los Angeles, and in the Omega Man, they did use Los Angeles as the setting for the desolate city. And I believe one of the producers said that they wanted to change the location to New York City because in Los Angeles, quote, at 3 o'clock, Los Angeles already looks desolate. Whereas New York, the city that never sleeps, there's always people. There's always, traffic. There's always something going on. And so it would be a much more stark contrast to see a big metropolitan city like New York be eerily desolate. And the film does a really good job of displaying that. Now, I do have some criticisms with this film, and I feel there is a character of a dog that Will Smith owns as a pet, as a companion. And there's a situation involving the dog that I feel after this situation, the film starts to degenerate. And this is where some of the problems that I have with the film lie. Some of the problems, the criticisms that I have with the film lie mostly within the second and third act of the film. Now, I stated that some of the I'm not too big of a fan of CGI work, but in the shots where New York City is rendered desolate and they had to use CGI to remove the people and add the vegetation growing out of buildings, that looks wonderful. There's some scenes where wild animals are running through the streets, and of course that's something that you do need to use CGI with, because it would be impossible to train wild animals in a situation like that. And for sequences like that, they're executed perfectly. My criticism comes with those that are infected. And the film does have a genuinely creepy sequence where Will Smith's character is chasing after the dog into this abandoned building. And I remember sitting in there with my friends watching an IMAX showing of this particular film. There was a shot, a really eerie shot, where Will Smith's characters encounter what they call the Darkseekers in this abandoned building. Genuinely creepy. But as the film goes on, when you see more of them, it's one of those situations where once you see more of the monster exposed, it becomes less frightening. And my criticism was that the way how the Darkseekers were rendered was mostly through CGI. Now, they did hire actors to play the Darkseekers, and they did add some a little bit of makeup prosthetics, but I guess in dailies they weren't too convinced, so they went back and they had CGI to do all the work, and it kind of it made those infected less scary. They were able to, you know, for instance, their jaws uh, extend at a very unnatural looking way, which kind of defies the laws of physics. And in some instances, it almost kind of comes off laughable. Um, yeah, especially in some of the close up shots between the Darkseekers and Will Smith. Like I said, Will Smith plays Robert Neville, who is one of the few people that's immune to this disease. He's a scientist who spends his days trying to find a cure to reverse the cure for cancer. And so it's kind of cool to see his struggle, going through all these tests to come to that conclusion. But yeah, going back to the Darkseekers, the other thing that really bothered me too was that in the novel, those that are infected are vampires, no question about it. Even in the novel, they kind of play with the idea of vampire mythology. The character of Robert Neville in the book, kind of laughs off the idea that the mythology of vampires should be a way to destroy those that are infected. And, as the story progresses, he kind of succumbs to that idea to dispatch those infected by means of the, older European ways of dispatching vampires. In this version, there's no mention of vampires whatsoever. In fact, there is a quick shot of Emma Thompson where she's like smiling, and it almost kind of looks like she has fangs, but maybe it's like a Mandela effect, or maybe it's my way of trying to view the film through like rose-colored glasses, as them trying to make some sort of a connection to vampirism. Also, in the Omega Man, they weren't vampires. Also, they were kind of like mutations from radiation. And the interesting thing is that in both the novel and in the Vincent Price film The Last Man on Earth and in the Omega Man, those that are infected are very articulate. They can speak. In fact, there's, in those adaptations, there's many moments where they're banging on the doors outside of Robert Neville's home, demanding that Robert Neville come out because he has they want his blood. You don't get that in this film. Yeah, you do see them run around the city, but the way how they portrayed those infected in this film, they portrayed them as much more zombie-like, which is kind of a disservice because at this point we were starting to already get an oversaturation of zombie films, starting with 28 Days Later, the remake of Dawn of the Dead, Romero's Land of the Dead, and it felt like this version of I Am Legend was trying to cater to those films, and the way how those infected are running was very reminiscent of those that were infected in Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later. So that kind of, for me at least, degenerated the film. And the other thing was that the ending of this film, the resolution of this film, is different from what's in the book and what's in Last Man on Earth. If you read the book, the idea is that the infected are no longer the monsters. Robert Neville is the monster, which it's kind of a play on the title that he is the legend. Like vampires were legends of mythology. Robert Neville is a legend of, you know, of what he is. It's kind of a very nuanced play on the title, and this film kind of obscures that. It doesn't really. It completely omits that notion. Um, Even though they do try to shoehorn in the title towards the end of the film in a semi pretentious way, so they changed the ending of the book, and it kind of it's kind of a disservice to what the movie could have actually been. Um, Speaking of what the movie could have actually been, this version of I Am Legend went through so many phases of pre-production ever since the mid '90s. I believe at one point Arnold Schwarzenegger was going to play Robert Neville, which would have been interesting, but I feel that a version of I Am Legend with Arnold Schwarzenegger would should have been a product of the '80s. Like it should have been like an '80s sci-fi action film, and it probably would have fallen into obscurity, kind of like The Running Man, and then later on find its audience. Yeah, like I mean, I don't want to spoil too much with the differences between the book. I highly recommend that you read the book by Richard Matheson. Again, he's the author of so many great horror novels, so many classic Twilight Zone episodes. Um, the particular version of I Am Legend that I own is this really nice looking, handsome tin case that comes with 2 discs, some really cool special features. There's some really cool special features where they do like kind of like a graphic novel, animated graphic novel that are kind of prequel. They're kind of like a prequel to the movie that take place all over the world. So I think there's like one that takes place in China, and it's like it's a prequel to the events in the film, and that I thought was kind of cool to kind of show the other places of the world that were affected by this. There's a really cool Easter egg in the beginning of this film to Batman versus Superman. There's a scene where Will Smith is walking through a desolate Times Square, and you see a huge billboard for it has the Batman and Superman logo. And this was years before BVS ever came out, but it was a cool little Easter egg to see. Yeah, and other than that, I still do recommend it. Like I said, there are some moments of genuine creepiness, and yeah, definitely check it out. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you next week. Good night.